Welcome to the Groves Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Groves. Healthcare has been credited with pulling us out of the last recession. Between 2006 and 2016, healthcare jobs grew 7 times faster than any other industry, providing much needed work to those in need at the time. Healthcare is also the economic engine for many communities, particularly those that are rural. And so we have to take that into account when we talk about the speed and the how of healthcare transformation. But the costs are staggering, and you've heard many, many times they're unsustainable. Well, so far we have sustained them, but at what cost? 100 million Americans struggle with medical debt today. It remains the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy. And 1 out of 2 of us in the last year put off needed care because of healthcare costs. It's cold comfort that we've come so far when so many don't have access to the system. And yet there is reason for optimism, but it's going to take all of us doing what we can to help turn this system around. And in order to do that, we need to understand the system, why it is designed the way it is today, how we got here, and what we can do about it. And so that's what the Groves Connection is about. I'm really interested in having in-depth conversations with insiders and experts so that I can learn what they know. And I'd like you to do that with me. These conversations start usually with inquiring about how they got where they are. What was their life journey like? What motivates them? And I think it's interesting to find out what kind of people they are before we hear what their positions are and what we should do. But we will get into the details. We'll talk about innovative care models, but we'll also talk about what they believe are the solutions, the things that can get us to the next level so that we can have a much more accessible, affordable, and equitable system. I think that's what we all want. And we know that we have the resources to do that. It's a matter of understanding and then influencing the trajectory of healthcare policy and managing our own healthcare as best we can. I invite you now to get curious, and I'll ask you, are you ready to connect? Action. Dr. Eric Becker, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Dr. Robert Groves, thanks for having me.
Hey, I came across your work on LinkedIn, and I have just been fascinated by all of the knowledge that you have about healthcare and how it works and all of the machinations behind the scenes. And I really want to say great work in helping to educate the population about how this works and why we are where we are. And hopefully that gets us to a place where we can figure out what to do about it at some point. But before we get into all that, I want to know a little bit about you. Can you tell the audience, first of all, where did you grow up?
Sure. Suburbs of Washington, D.C., Maryland.
Is that right? And what was your aspiration? Let's go back all the way to grade school. Were you thinking about what when I grow up, I want to be, or was medicine always in the cards? How did that work for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking me. So I don't have any doctors in my family at all. So, and actually being from the suburbs of Washington, D.C. is actually central to how I became a physician, in that I actually grew up in the town next door to the National Institutes of Health. And we actually had a family friend at our church who worked there. She was a researcher, a scientist in one of the labs. And they have a summer internship program at the NIH. And when I was 16, she approached me and my family and said, hey, we got the summer internship program. Would you be interested in doing it? And I just mowed lawns in the summer. They said, it pays $9 an hour. And I said, shoot, if I could be inside in air conditioning and pay $9 an hour, I'll do it. Like, I had no idea what the job involved. And the woman approached me because she's like, okay, Eric, what kind of like science, he's kind of into that kind of stuff. I was friends with her son. It was a histology lab in the National Institutes of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases. So it was like the orphan child of orphan childs, right? So NIDDK is not one of the popular, it's not like NCI or anything like that. And it was a histology lab. I mean, everything was molecular and cell biology and genetics, and they were still using microscopes. And it was a lab that was all run by women. And I was the only guy in the lab. By fate or whatever, I kind of naturally gravitate to like things that are not like the fancy, like, sexy, popular, things to do. So like histology at NIDDK was definitely not, was not fancy, but fantastic experience, wonderful people to work with. But I'm still kind of a people person. And so the head of the lab, Dr. E. Joan Blanchett Mackey, said, well, if you really like, medical science and what we're doing here in the lab, then you might want to think about being a doctor. And so I said, okay, that's an interesting idea. And because I didn't have any doctors in the family, she's like, well, you really should go shadow a doctor or what have you. And so I was able to, just volunteer in a ER at a local hospital for the summer. And I just loved hanging out in the suture room. And I would kind of be like the retractor guy or whatever, just kind of, talking with the docs and the nurses and the patients while they were doing suturing. And at that point, I was in college. And I had gotten a letter from the college saying, hey, look, if you're pre-med, you got to let us know because you got to get an advisor. And it's kind of a long process. You got certain classes you got to take. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll just check the box. Sounds like a good idea. And that kind of got me started on the path. Now, while I was in that ER, every single doctor I talked to said, whatever you do, do not become a physician. And this was in the 90s when HMOs and managed care were, and the government were like, quote unquote, ruining the practice of medicine. So they said, whatever you do, do not become a doctor. And I said, why? And they said, oh, because of the insurance companies and blah, blah, blah. So when I was in college, I majored in economics, frankly, as just a fallback, because in the 90s, it was super hard to get into medical school. Like they basically told us at our college, they're like, look, over half of you who want to go to medical school, you're not going to get in. And so I'm like, okay, well, if there's a 50-50 chance I'm not going to get in, then I better have a plan B. So I'm like, okay, if I get an economics degree, I could probably get a job.
Gotcha.
In the late 90s, when I graduated from college, they were just giving jobs away. And so I was like, hey, instead of going straight to medical school, let me learn about this, finance HMO thing before I go to medical school, see if it's what I really want to do. And actually got a job as a hospital finance consultant right out of college. And because believe it or not, doctors and hospitals don't know how to get paid. So they hire outside consultants to come in and show them how to do that. So I learned all about CPT codes. And at that time, there was the UB92s. It wasn't even the UB04s for the facility bills. And then the professional bills are called HCFA 1500s because CMS didn't even exist. Before CMS, it was called HCFA, the Healthcare Financing Administration, as part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So all the bills were called HCFA 1500s. In fact, they're still called that today. So I learned all about the billing and the codings, fascinating. And it was, of course, working in these major hospitals. It was a total disaster, right? Like the hospitals didn't know what they were doing. The insurance company didn't know what they were doing. The patients were caught in the middle. They're like, what's going on? And it was just a total disaster. And I said, okay, well, I could want to kind of work in this, area because it's such a mess. And so I knew I kind of wanted to have an atypical career. I was living in Chicago at the time. So I went to the University of Illinois for medical school. And the University of Illinois Medical School is in Chicago. It's not downstate in Champaign-Urbana. And I was super fortunate because the University of Illinois is associated with Cook County Hospital. It's right next door. So there was that TV show ER in the 90s that was sort of took place in Cook County Hospital. So I did my family practice rotation.
For the listeners, Cook County Hospital is famous or infamous, if you will, for just a variety of emergency room visits, hospitalizations, particularly for underserved populations. It's a county hospital and it is busy. And so it's in one sense, it's a great place to cut your teeth if you want to see anything and everything that happens in an emergency room or a hospital.
That's right. And it kind of looked like it doesn't even exist anymore. They moved to a new hospital, but it kind of looked like a museum. All the ORs were on the top floor and they actually leaked when it rained. The lights weren't working in the outpatient family practice clinic. So they literally hung like light bulbs, like you see like in a coal mine.
But let me ask you, at the time that you were there, did they still have wards?
That's right. 30, 40 patients in a huge, basically hallway. And it was totally medicine kind of in the 1950s. But the thing I want to add too is that the University of Illinois shipped you around to a bunch of different hospitals. So I actually went to a community hospital for my OBGYN rotation. I went to the VA for my internal medicine rotation. I was at a Northside community hospital for my psychiatry rotation that actually had an inpatient psych ward. So it was a perfect experience to learn about the US healthcare system, because as you did your clerkship and your sub-internships, you didn't just practice at the academic medical center. You went to a whole bunch of different types of hospitals and you worked with a whole bunch of different types of physicians.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so it was awesome. I mean, and of course, I never was like, oh, I'm going to go to the University of Illinois because that's the kind of experience I would have. I mean, it was totally by luck that I had that. I wasn't necessarily infatuated with one particular organ or organ system. I'm like,
Gotcha.
kind of like how, kind of like people in general. And I loved surgery, but I loved taking care of the surgical patients on the floor. And the surgeons were like, oh, if you like floor work.
Yeah, they welcomed you with open arms, I'm sure, because that's the part that they don't like. Exactly.
That's right. I love doing that stuff. So anyway, went to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore for my internal medicine residency because I was from Baltimore. I'm from Maryland, but I had a chance to go back to Maryland for my residency. Of course, that was a fantastic experience. Amazing doctors, et cetera. I thought, okay, this is where, CMS is headquartered in Baltimore. They do a ton of health services research at Hopkins. Right. I'm like, this is a perfect opportunity to kind of marry my two interests. But I quickly learned during my intern year that research was just too slow for me, that my personality just sort of requires, I just need to see the fruits of my labor a little bit quicker. And so I kept in touch with one of my healthcare consulting colleagues. And so we started a company actually while I was in residency at Hopkins. I had to get special permission from the department chair in order to do that. It's a little odd for a resident to start a business.
So talk to us about that. Where did that idea come from? What's the company and what does it do?
A gentleman, his name is Scott Shainvogel. He and I were good friends when we were working together, and he had moved on to become the EVP of finance for a major hospital system in Dallas. And at the age of 27, he had 1,000 people working for him, and he was responsible for collecting $3 billion of hospital revenue. So incredibly talented, capable person.
Yeah.
And he was just seeing how much of a mess it was still for patients when they were trying to get through the system. And I was seeing the clinical implications at the patient bedside when it related to prior authorizations and scheduling problems and lack of coordination of care. And so he and I were like, look, between the two of us, we know how to navigate people through the jungle of the U.S. healthcare system.
Right.
And instead of, paving the jungle and making it easy to cross, we're really good guides, and we can kind of hold people's hands and let them know where the jaguars and the piranhas and the snakes were and how to get across. And so we started a company where we would sell that service to employers as part of their employee benefits package. And this was at the start of what are referred to as HSA health plans or consumer-directed health plans, where the co-pays go away and you have this quote-unquote money on a debit card. And then when they swipe that debit card at the doctor's office or at the hospital, some sort of magical, mysterious amount comes off of that. Yeah. And so we said, okay, well, we actually created a database of all the in-network allowed amount pricing for Blue Cross United, Cigna, Aetna back in 2007. So we could actually tell people in advance what their prices were going to be. And then instead of just giving it to them on a website, we're actually we'll have a personal concierge. So we had literally hundreds of these healthcare ninjas that you would interact with by phone and app and on email that were essentially your guides through the healthcare system. Now, we didn't make any clinical decisions. That was still between the doc and the patient. But all that other junk that typically, if you called the insurance company, they'd be like, well, it's not our fault, it's the doctor's fault. If you called up the doctor's office, they'd be like, well, it's not our fault, it's the insurance company's fault. And now the patient's stuck in the middle. And so now, instead of them being stuck in the middle, they would call a Compass and be like, can you figure this out for me? And we would figure it out for them. Problem medical bills, finding specialists, et cetera. The punchline is we grew that to about 2,000 employer clients, including T-Mobile, Southwest Airlines, McDonald's. We supported about 1.8 million people. We started it in 2007. We sold the business in 2018 to another company. And it was just a fantastic experience.
What was the name of that business? Can you
It's called
share
Compass
that?
Professional Health Services.
Gotcha. You have a really broad perspective on the finance side of things, and it sounds like you have a brain for it too. Like that is something that is interesting to you. And my belief is that we tend to blame anybody that's convenient, depending on which side of the fence we sit on. We can point our fingers at the insurance company. We can point our fingers at physician groups that can be mercenary sometimes. We can point our fingers at big pharma that is, from one perspective, price gouging. But I think that all of the vast majority of the people that I've met in healthcare are good people that really want to do the right thing. but they work in a system that has some pretty perverse incentives. How do you see that world? Do you think that there are really bad actors out there or bad companies out there?
It's a great point. And in short, I agree with you. And I also think the answer is both. So yes, the incentives themselves are problematic. Now, at the end of the day, I also believe that systems and incentives do not magically appear, that they are actually created by people. And so ultimately, I believe in responsibility. And so I actually do think we have responsibility as individuals to create things and then also to change things that we don't like. Now, to your point about incentives, my favorite quote about incentives is actually by Charlie Munger from Berkshire Hathaway. He's kind of Warren Buffett's right-hand man. Yeah. Charlie Munger has been on the board of a hospital in Los Angeles for 35 years. So Charlie Munger actually knows a lot about healthcare. And he says, like, of course, healthcare is screwed up. The incentives are all wrong. And what he means by that is the incentives do not put the patient first. When we say wrong, when we say healthcare is messed up, what that means to me is that the ultimate reason that healthcare exists, the reason that I'm a doctor, the reason that you're a doctor, is because the patient comes first. That's what they told me on the very first day of medical school. And that was said to me over and over and over again in medical school and residency. And I believe it. The patient absolutely does come first. And the incentives in healthcare largely do not put the patient first. So whenever we say, okay, is this incentive the right thing to do? I ask myself, okay, well, does this incentive put the patient first? And if the answer is no, then we should probably change it.
Let me say that I understand that we have an obligation to fix it, but the how has gotten extremely complicated. And, first step, perhaps, is education of the public. I mean, that things like, Duexis exist to me, and that Duexis, for those of you who don't know, is a patented formula of two over-the-counter, very inexpensive drugs. And it is basically, the familiar names are, or the brand names are Pepcid and Advil. And what this company did was they combined them and said, well, you only have to take this once a day instead of multiple times a day. And to insurance companies, the cost of that drug can be over $1,000 a month. You could get it over the counter, same effect. You'd have to take it, 2 or 3 times a day, but same effect for about $40 a month. The problem is that is shielded from the patient, and it puts the doctor in a tough spot. Because the other thing that pharmaceutical companies have done is they've set up these nonprofits that are coupons, if you will, that cover the copay. So it makes it easier for patients to get their drugs. So on the back end, behind the scenes, the insurance company is getting charged a huge amount. By the way, that's your premium that's paying for that. But on the front end, if I'm sitting in front of a patient, I can either write a script for this drug, which they can get for free, or I can tell them to go buy it over the counter. Well, if your patient is your, priority and folks are struggling, you're going to make the decision that puts that patient first in this situation, which means the drug is free. But what happens over time is that constant things like that accumulate and premiums go up for everybody. And so the long-term effect is to raise healthcare prices. And there are countless examples of things like that, not only in the pharmacy side, but across healthcare. How do we get at fixing those sorts of problems, and particularly in an era when lobbying is so effective in Congress, and Congress is in such conflict constantly?
Yeah, you bring up a great point. So in healthcare, there are some sort of big, I'll just call them forces that need to be understood, or rules. One of my roommates when I was in medical school was an architecture graduate student. He was from Greece. okay, and born and raised in Greece. He just came to America to study. Okay, we go to a football game. He's like, I don't understand this at all, and it's because he didn't know the rules. He didn't understand. Yeah. He saw people hitting each other, but he didn't know what was going on. People were cheering. He's like, and so the point is that you can literally see what's going on. You can see the duexis. You can see the tackles. But if you don't understand the rules of what's going on behind the scenes, then you can't put it in context.
Right.
So people look at healthcare and they're like, it's so confused. It's because you don't know the rules. Now, in this conversation, we can't go over all the rules. It's like trying to explain football in like 2 minutes to my roommate, right? I can't explain football in 2 minutes, right? But there are some specific rules, specifically as it relates to duexis, okay? And that is what is referred to as third-party payment. Right. So healthcare is unique in that it is not paid for by the people who are actually receiving the care. It's paid for by a third party. So in other consumer industries, the person who's receiving the good or service is also the person who has the money to pay for the good or service. Right. And in healthcare, it's not like that. And so ultimately, the customer is split between who's receiving the service and who's paying for the service. Those are two very different, quote unquote, customers that you're trying to please when you have third-party payment. And it creates very perverse incentives. So anytime you think about healthcare, whenever you're thinking about what's going on in healthcare, you have to frame it in the context of third-party payment.
Let's walk back a step or two, and I want to understand a little bit more about your journey. So did you practice? Did you actively practice medicine for a time?
I did. I worked as a hospitalist at one of the major hospital systems here in Dallas, and I was at one of their community hospitals out in the suburbs. Man, it was a fantastic experience. Yeah. I mean, listen, being a doctor out in the community, woo! Yeah. It's different.
There's something extremely rewarding about that caring relationship between a physician and a patient. Certainly the primary care relationship, my dad was a doc, and so I used to do house calls with him way back when. And it was just an extremely rewarding experience to see that relationship develop, evolve, and solidify. And, one of the things that I have learned over the years, and in particular from Brent James, is that if you ask patients what they expect, the number one thing is caring. They understand that, cure is often not an option, but what they want is somebody who cares and who has their best interests first. And I think to some extent we've let that slide a little bit too far down. And there are some who would say it's the tyranny of metrics that are driving some of that, and the industrialization of the healthcare mega complex, I guess, is another way of saying it. How do you think about those issues and where we go from here?
One of the best things about the care and the therapy, we talk about the therapeutic relationship between doctor and patient, and that is 100% the case. And that care is actually not just like an abstract concept. And that, I went to a wedding once, and the minister presiding over the wedding said, love is spelled Time. And so really the way to express love for patients, to care for patients, is to spend time with them.
I love that.
I know. And believe it or not, just as a quick aside, the minister at this wedding was a family friend, and he was a hospice minister. And it ended up being like the best wedding service I've ever heard.
That's a great quote. I'm going to steal that from you, Eric. That is exactly the case. Yeah.
Doctors that really care, that really have that therapeutic relationship with their patient, they spend time with their patients. Now, to your point before about incentives, the quote unquote healthcare system is incentivized for doctors to spend less time with patients. Yeah. So really what the really great doctors have done is they've essentially said, I'm going to throw the incentive out the window, and I'm going to do I'm actually going to go against the incentive, and I'm going to do what I think is right. And when you go against the incentive, it has implications. So in academia, the more time they spend with patients, the less time they spend on research and publication, which is what gets you promoted and what gets you tenure. And so literally the best doctor at Johns Hopkins that I know, and I did residency. I mean, he won the award for like best resident. I mean, he's the doctor that took care of Donald Trump when he got COVID. Okay. The most important person in the world gets COVID. Who do they call? This guy.
And his academic promotion status has
his colleagues full professor. He is not, because he spends so much time. He does a pulmonary fibrosis clinic at Hopkins that he stays till 9 p.m. every week. When he does it, the clerks give him the keys and say, lock the door on your way out. That caring relationship is not supported by fee-for-service medicine. Okay, so we talked about academics and research. It's also not supported by fee-for-service medicine, where you just want to, build as many CPT codes as possible. Yeah. The really good doctors say, hey, to heck with that. I'm going to spend the time I need with my patients.
And I think what is difficult for non-physicians to understand is that's how much time it takes. I remember trying to perform, or produce, I guess, at the same level as my colleagues when I first went into practice. And I was always the first car in the parking lot, and I was always the last car to leave the parking lot, because I initially I thought, well, I'm slow, but I'm not slow. It is that it takes time to establish relationships, and spelling love, T-I-M-E, is the shorthand for that knowledge. So let me ask you, how do you think docs should be paid? Is it salary? Is it capitation? Is it, what should docs be paid for?
Yeah. So in terms of aligning incentives, I think it's also very important to understand that, because healthcare is it's like $4 trillion. It's almost like 20% of our entire economy. It's not a monolith. So I actually don't think that all doctors should be paid the same way. And so this is where, if we're just going to divide it up into two big areas, I believe that fee for service has a time and a place. And I think it's for specialist care. And I think that fee for service is a horrible way to pay for primary care. And that insurance, the whole concept of insurance, makes sense for specialist care. The entire concept of insurance doesn't make sense for primary care. I work a lot with employers in America in their healthcare spend. Employers spend more on healthcare than anything else. They spend more than the federal government spends on healthcare, right? Is the really innovative employers have actually separated that out. And they said, look, for primary care, we're going to have an on-site or a near-site clinic where we pay the doctor a salary, because we want them to spend time with our employees and their family members, independent of this whole billing rigmarole. And they could employ the doctor themselves. They could use a vendor that it's another company that runs the clinic, and they don't get rid of their Blue Cross United insurance, policy. They're just like, look, you're going to need ER visits, and you're going to need to deliver babies, and you're going to have surgery and cancer and heart attacks and all this sort of stuff. We'll keep paying them fee for service, but we're going to completely separate that out from the primary care that we provide to our employees. And guess what? Hugely successful. They have kept their healthcare costs down or flat for decades. Wow. And this is not some quote unquote theory. This has been done. Yeah. So it's absolutely doable.
One of the things that has happened to healthcare in this country over, the last 2-3 decades probably, is we've moved away from primary care, and it's become all about patient choice. And I'll Google what's going on, and then I'll go see a specialist, because there is no quote gatekeeper. I'm not forced to go to a primary care physician, and I don't choose to establish that relationship. How do you get around that, or do you incentivize patients to go see a primary care doc to get that done?
Great question. And the short answer is yes, you incentivize it. And what these companies do is they use a very simple tool. They make it free. You want to go to a primary care doctor? It's free. Guess what? People understand free. Free is not a complicated concept.
Yeah, great point. And obviously, you found it to be cost effective. Why aren't more companies doing that?
One person I'll tell you about is a guy named John Torinus, Torinus. He's the CEO of a company called Serigraph that makes dashboards for cars and trucks. They're based in Wisconsin, got about 1,000 employees, self-funded. And he put in an on-site clinic at his company, and he kept his healthcare costs flat for 9 years while tremendously improving the health of his employees. And he wrote a book about it called The Company That Solved Healthcare. And it's like this big, it's a super easy read. It is to this day still the best book, in my opinion, that has ever been written about the healthcare industry in America. I've spoken at conferences alongside John Torinus. And, sometimes he'll go first, sometimes I'll go first. It's happened on multiple occasions. And every time he would get up in front of an audience, the first thing he says is, I'm here to apologize on behalf of the CEOs of America, because the CEOs of America have forgotten the golden rule, which is he or she who has the gold makes the rules. And so we, as the employers in America, we've got the gold, and we have essentially neglected or handed over the responsibility for running the health and the healthcare spending of our company to other people. And ultimately, he says that is the CEOs and the employers' fault for doing that.
Interesting. That is absolutely fascinating. Can you spell his last name again for us one more time?
Sure. Torinus. Torinus.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I think that'll be a valuable tool for everybody. So there are so many organizations out there that are coalitions of large companies that are saying we've got to address healthcare. Why can't we get over the hump and actually do this? And you've pointed the finger directly at CEOs, but I think you're absolutely right. The reason it hasn't happened is because they don't understand it. They push it over to HR and say, you guys manage this. HR then hires a broker and says, you guys manage this, and you get what you've always gotten. How do we change that pattern?
Yeah, so it's a great point. So one of the key features of Serigraph is that it's a private company. It's not publicly traded. And so ultimately, if you're the CEO of a publicly traded company, which if you look at these, big, business groups on health or whatever, a lot of times their membership is made up of publicly traded companies, then really there's just so much quarterly pressure to deliver on earnings per share that, look, at the end of the day, I actually don't blame the CEOs of these large companies, because they got a gazillion priorities, and the number one thing is their earnings per share, which is largely driven by their top line revenue. And so they really have to grow the business to grow earnings per share. And at the end of the day, healthcare is just not a priority for them. And these are smart people. Believe me, those CEOs, they could understand, I'm not that smart, okay? If I can understand this, they can understand this. The point is they don't prioritize it, and they're never going to, which is why the real innovation in healthcare, one, it happened with John Torinus in private companies. Okay, so private companies are the most innovative. Who else is the most innovative? It's actually municipalities. It's state governments and city governments and county governments, because they can't raise sales. They can't raise revenue. What are you going to do? Increase taxes? That's super hard to do. And so they're stuck with rising healthcare costs.
Right.
And literally they can't spend money on stuff to deliver services to their citizens, because they're spending so much money on healthcare for their employees. And so really it's states like Montana, it's states like Ohio, it's states like Kentucky and North Carolina at the state level, and it's municipalities. If you go to Indiana and Wisconsin, the vast majority of school systems and municipalities in those two states have on-site clinics. Why Indiana and Wisconsin? Because Indiana and Wisconsin have some of the highest healthcare costs in America. So it's no coincidence, because their governments can't pay for it.
So your perspective really is that, and this is based on experience, is that your advice to a head of any company is, if you really want to get healthcare costs under control, then focus on creating free primary care for your employees.
You got it.
That's it?
That is the number one step that you can do. And so a lot of companies are like, yeah, but my employees are spread out, yada, yada, yada. Like
Right.
that's where you can have them go to direct primary care practices or
Right.
virtual primary care, like the number one. Or listen, you could be like, look, I still want to be in a fee for service environment or yada, yada, yada. You can change your plan design so that you can make the primary care visits incredibly cheap. Like, and you want that, okay? You like want them going to the primary care doctor for a hangnail and spend $5 for that. Like you actually want that because as an internist and what other primary care doctors do every time they see you is what's called RHM, which is routine health maintenance, which is, look, you're here for your hangnail, but you know what? You're 5'5" and you weigh 330 pounds and you smoke. And listen, you didn't come in for that. But we've got to talk about that.
Yeah.
Because you're married and you've got kids. And if they didn't come in for their $5 hangnail visits, we would never have that conversation.
Yeah, the converse of that is if you go to a dermatologist for your hangnail, no criticism of dermatologists, but they're going to focus on their area of specialty and they're going to, not address the rest because that's not what they do. My question for you is this, and I'm going to walk through a couple of scenarios. So I understand what your recommendation is. If you want to change healthcare costs for your company, focus on primary care. So if you are an insurance company, would what I think I just heard you say is focus on plan design to incentivize primary care. Is that right?
So here's another rule about healthcare, right? Going back to our football analogy, okay? Insurance companies in general actually do not bear risk and are actually not insurance companies. They are, and even in fact, United Health Group itself says it is a healthcare services company. They don't even call themselves an insurance company. When Cigna has earnings calls with their investors, they come out and they say, look, really only about 35% of our business has risk. The rest does not. So the risk is not borne by the insurance company. The risk is borne by the employer.
Yes,
okay?
Indeed. Most people don't understand that, Eric. Yeah, help us with this. Yeah.
The insurance company just facilitates the transaction. They're like Visa and MasterCard, okay? When you use your Visa card, you're like, oh yeah, Visa's taking a whole bunch of risk when I buy. No, Visa's not taking the risk. You are. You're paying for it. Visa just facilitates the transaction. Now, Visa takes about 3 to 6% for that, and the health insurance company takes about 15 to 20% for that. It's their quote unquote medical loss ratio. The employer bears the risk. Any doctor who thinks that they're quote unquote socking it to the insurance company is wrong. They're wrong, okay? Never tell a doctor that they're wrong, but I'm telling a doctor right now, they're wrong. Healthcare costs have been going like this. Insurance company revenue and stock prices have also been going like this. Health insurance companies do not need healthcare costs to go down to make money. Now, there's exceptions to that. One, Medicare Advantage. So like, yeah, but what about my Medicare HMO people? Yes, they take risk on Medicare HMO folks. But if you got a commercially insured member who's under the age of 65 and has Blue Cross United, Cigna, Aetna, that even if they're fully insured, the insurance carrier just socks them with a premium increase the next year.
So the bottom line is in any given year, because the premium has been set, your insurance company is very interested in keeping costs down. But at the end of the year, they'll tally up the damage and they'll reset premiums for the following year. So in terms of a multi-year strategy, it does not matter to the insurance company if prices go up. They're just essentially what they're doing is trying to predict how much prices are going to go up next year because we're setting the premiums now for next year. Is that?
Now, and because of Obamacare, and this has been well documented, keep in mind that what we're just describing here is in health insurance, there's two types. There's fully insured and self-insured.
Right.
In self-insured, the employer literally pays out the claims. The money is wired from the employer to the doctor or the hospital by the insurance company. Like the insurance company never has the money, okay? The employer is bearing the risk. And what you're describing, which is fully insured, is where the employer pays a premium to the insurance company, and then the insurance company then takes that premium money and then pays the doctor, okay? As a result of the Affordable Care Act, it put in place what is referred to as a minimum loss ratio, which says that quote unquote fully insured health insurance plan can only keep 15 cents out of every dollar. So the incentive for the insurance company, and believe me, they get almost to the penny 15 cents on the dollar. Like they're very good at that. If you listen to their earnings calls, they call it different things, but they're super close to 85% paid out in claims, 15% they keep. So what's 15% of $1 million? 150 grand. What's 15% of $2 million? 300 grand. An insurance company for their fully insured business wants healthcare costs to go up because they want 15% of a larger number.
The way I think about it, Eric, to be, maybe it's too kind, is they have no incentive to keep costs down. I don't know that there's any active engagement in, wanting costs to go up, because health insurance executives are patients too, so there is the other side of that coin. But what I would say is there is zero incentive to keep costs down, because at your point, the point you're making is the more expensive healthcare is, the bigger that 15% gets.
What you just said, if you have competition among health insurance carriers, then they're going to compete to keep healthcare costs down, because otherwise you're like, well, if my premium keeps going up, then I'm just going to shop for a different health insurance plan. And here's the problem, is that in many states, there is not sufficient competition among health insurance carriers.
There's one dominant carrier.
In Alabama, Blue Cross of Alabama has 85% of the business. In North Carolina, Blue Cross of North Carolina, vast majority of the business. In Michigan, in Illinois, you have huge states. I'm not talking about Delaware here. In very big states, you have one insurance carrier. So there's really not a lot of choice.
And then on the other side, when the employer is footing the bill, when you're talking about self-insured, and as you pointed out, there are two categories. There's the fully insured, where the insurance company is collecting the premium, paying the bills. And then there's the self-insured, where the insurance company is simply passing through that transaction, applying all the rules and making sure all the regulations get checked, et cetera. And so they're an intermediary, essentially. But on the self-insured side, I think the same argument applies. If there were multiple effective insurance companies in a given state, then there would be competition to show these self-insured businesses, look, we can keep your prices down.
That's right.
What would need to change about insurance contracting, the insurance business, to get this under?
One of the major forces in healthcare that causes healthcare costs to rise is consolidation and lack of competition. And that exists both on the hospital side and on the insurance carrier side. And so what allows prices to rise is a lack of competition, right? Because at the end of the day, people can vote with their feet, or companies can vote with where they spend their premium dollars. But if you don't have much of a choice, and so this gets back to, now this is going to get super boring, so I'll make it quick. I'll rip the Band-Aid off super quick. Antitrust enforcement in America has changed dramatically since the 1970s, where antitrust implementation, one, didn't apply to health insurance companies because of something called the McCarran-Ferguson Act. So literally the feds couldn't go after them for antitrust reasons until literally the very end of 2021. Like literally the McCarran-Ferguson Act was just repealed, or I think it was 2020. It's the very end of 2020 that it was just repealed. Okay. So literally the Sherman Antitrust Act could not be applied to health insurance companies because of that law that was passed during World War II. So this is a brand spanking new opportunity. Number two is on the hospital side, is that the way that both Republican and Democratic administrations enforced antitrust law is they didn't look at the degree of competition in a marketplace. They just said, hey, is this hurting consumers or not? And that applied to all businesses, not just healthcare. And so there's been massive consolidation across many areas. And there's actually much less competition across many different industries now, frankly, because of a lack of antitrust enforcement by the federal government. And then the question becomes, will that change? Will that ever change? I don't know. But the way that antitrust legislation, I mean, at the end of the day, like AT&T was broken up because it was expensive and it had terrible service.
Yes.
Like, I don't know if anybody remembers like the phone company from the early 80s. It was horrible.
Yes,
and it was like, you wanted to call somebody one state away, it would cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah.
It was horrible. And the way that they addressed that was they broke up AT&T. And so at the end of the day, I think healthcare would be much better if we had a lot more insurance companies and we had a lot more hospital systems. That the degree of concentration within healthcare in and of itself is a problem. So like I think that it's not going to solve everything, but to the extent that absolute power corrupts absolutely, to the extent that you have more concentration of power in healthcare, it's going to get worse. Like the best way to make healthcare better is to decentralize it and to allow for competition and to allow people. And this is not a Republican or a Democratic idea. Believe me, ironically, the Biden administration actually wants to break up and actually enforce the antitrust stuff with these hospitals, right? Yeah. So it's not even a Democratic versus Republican thing. It's just a question of saying, do you have choice? And to the extent that we can allow more choice for people, I think it'd be a good thing.
So you're getting to an extremely important fundamental here, and that is healthcare is not a market in the traditional sense of that word, where the market, if there is a true market with transparency and competition, then yeah, it works to keep prices down and service up. But you've just described a situation where essentially there's not a market. Nobody can see behind the scenes to what the prices are. Consolidation is allowed. It's not so different from oil barons and railroad barons, and yeah.
That's exactly right. And I made a video about how healthcare essentially went through a revolution, because essentially what we did in healthcare in the 1950s was like almost nothing, right? I mean, we had very few interventions. And so we've gone through this huge revolution over the past 70 years, just like we went through the Industrial Revolution. And there'll need to be reforms within the industry as the medical revolution progressed. And I think that's only natural. I think we're on the right side of history. I mean, this is going to play out. And 50 years from now, we're going to look back at this time the way that we look back at the oil barons of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Like, this takes decades. Like, reforming healthcare actually is not going to be quote unquote better during my lifetime. This is going to take more than my lifetime to happen. But the point is that you keep pushing the ball down the field 1 yard at a time.
I wonder if it wound up 50 years from now. I'm not going to ask you to predict what that looks like. I'm going to ask you what you think, because there are two possible scenarios. One is a real market with real competition. The other is government price controls and single payer. So what do you think about the best solution long term?
Yeah, so it's a great point. And you actually bring up the correct dichotomy. It either needs to go one way or the other, right? So, every other industrialized country in America or in the world goes the centralized price controls, yada, yada, yada. And the real problem with healthcare right now is that we're in the middle. Essentially, we have a quote unquote capitalistic monopoly. And when you have capitalism without competition is exploitation, right? So right now we are in this exploitative environment in the middle. So it either needs to become a utility, it needs to become like the power company, right? There's not competition among the power company. It's like, but the government sets the rates on the power company, or it has to be competitive. But it's not going to be where we are today, and where we are today will keep getting worse and worse and worse. And then eventually it's going to go one way to the other. And to your point, right, I have no idea. Now, I will tell you that one of the most famous healthcare economists was a gentleman by the name of Uwe Reinhardt from Princeton University. Very famous. He had a book published posthumously that I encourage everybody. It's Not the Price is Stupid. I encourage everybody to read this book or listen to it on audiobook. It's fantastic. Interestingly, Uwe Reinhardt is from Germany, lived for a long time in Canada, and then only after that came to America. So he experienced different healthcare systems. And he said America uniquely should not have a single payer healthcare system like Germany or Canada, where he previously lived. And his reason for that is because he says the U.S. government is too corrupt for that. He says it would be a really bad idea. The single payer would be too corrupt.
I think it's important to point out here, too, that if you look at the challenges of rising prices in healthcare, that's happening around the world. I mean, that's not unique to the U.S. It's just that we've got a head start on cost. So it may be that the best solution is a competitive one in any case, it's really hard to tell. But until we have transparency in a market, that's impossible. You've been very generous with your time, Eric. Gosh, there's so many more. I hope you'll come back because there's so many more topics I'd love to explore with you. But tell us a little bit about what you do now, how people can find you, what you're going to be up to in the coming months, and let us know how we can learn more.
Sure. I create a series of YouTube videos on a channel called A Healthcare Z about healthcare finance. And I also post those videos on LinkedIn as well. And so if you'd like to watch those, you can just look me up on LinkedIn and follow me or connect with me, or you can subscribe to the channel on YouTube. I actually get about 120,000 people a month to watch these videos across both those platforms. So actually, hospital executives, insurance executives, pharmacy executives, I mean, you name it, they are watching these videos. So that's one way to do it. But I would also encourage all of you to do things like listen to more of Dr. Grove's podcast, because there's a lot of fantastic information by people just going out on their own and sharing the intricacies of healthcare. So the information is out there. And I think that if you just make the effort to look for it, then you're going to actually get a lot of it. And why am I saying this? Because then you'll get a true understanding of the rules, right? You're not going to be having a misunderstanding of how football works. So you're oh, because I listened to Dr. Grove's podcast. I know the rules of football. I know how healthcare really works. So thank you all for listening. And thank you so much, Dr. Groves, for having me on.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bricker. And we'll look forward to having you back in the future. And with that, we're going to say so long for this episode. Bye-bye, everybody. You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The Groves Connection.